man, they don't have to have a formal position on staff in order to act out of that purpose. We all have this thing in us that when I see Jesus for who he is, I want to be like him. At the end of the day, relationship often is built around something as opposed to a get together and say, we're going to be friends now, let's build relationship. It's usually built around a shared affinity. If the number one thing to do personally is seek God.
Hey friends, today I have with me Matt Swords from ECC, Ephrata Community Church, and let me just say that I've been super impressed at what I hear God is doing there. I understand that their leadership, they are seeking God and they are pointing their church to God, but I also, I hear about their vision for church planting and what they're saying, which I think is, I love the invitation they're giving their church, which I have been told from those that go there, they just want to plant churches. They don't care what kind of church it is, what it looks like, if it's about them, has their brand name, they're just asking who in the church has a heart to plant churches. And this podcast is about discipleship and disciple making, but from a church level, as I interview pastors, we can't be about discipleship unless we're also about church planting. That is the natural progression of people making disciples and then feeling at times called into a next level, another level of ministry, and wanting to lead a larger influence and reach even more people beyond groups. And so I think it's a healthy component to have. And beyond even that component, which we're not going to talk about church planting today, by the way, but there's also just their generosity to missions and their discipling culture that they have. And so Matt is the discipleship pastor there, and I understand he is core to this discipling DNA, and has been a catalyst to being very intentional about helping make sure people are growing in relationship to Jesus and not just attending church and doing church on Sundays. So Matt, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. And I'd love to hear from you, man, your backstory and also why are you so passionate about discipleship?
Yeah. Thanks, Alex, for having me on. It's an honor. And to try to not take too much time in some of the historical elements, I'm born and raised here in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and would have been in the construction field after high school for about 10 years. And while I was in construction, worked for a company, started a business with a friend, and then went off on my own for a number of years as well, and was involved at the church that I'm at now, and was volunteer leading the young adult ministry there for a number of years, 3 years, in fact, as a volunteer lead for that while in construction. And then that went really well. And the lead pastor here at our church asked me if I'd be interested in becoming the discipleship pastor here at the church. This is back in 2016 that I officially came on. So it's been over 8 years now. I serve as the discipleship pastor here at Ephrata Community Church, and really evolved into the role over the course of years. Again, my construction background, I never really imagined, I guarantee you, I promise you, I never wanted to be a pastor. It was never anything that I aspired to be. However, I discovered in leading the young adults for the years that I did that you kind of observe yourself getting passionate about things that you never knew you would become passionate about, which is, more of a curiosity as to why do some people grow and some people don't grow in their relationship with the Lord. I was growing really well, but, what was helping that growth and why did it come about? Why do I watch some people grow really well and then you see them again after a few months and they're not doing well? So, and when I would share messages and things and preparing messages, I just found myself so in love with the entire process of preparing messages, praying about them, asking for God's heart, sharing them with passion, watching people respond to them, and really caring deeply about people's walk with God. And it was kind of through that process, again, keeping it very simple and to the point, that although I never thought from a career point of view that I wanted to be a pastor ever, from a passion point of view, the care of people's spiritual walk with God and the desire to see them do well, whether I was a pastor or not actually didn't matter, because that is just more of a formality as it relates to what was really inside of me driving as I'd meet with people, talk with people, share messages with groups that like, man, I cared so much about people grasping the love of Jesus over their lives, understanding the scriptures and what it means, the promises of God that are yes, and for us today. So it was more of an observation of those things over years. And then, of course, Kevin, our lead pastor, and what an incredible offer to me and an incredible moment when he invited me to come to the team. And it took all but 5 seconds of prayer and consideration with my wife before I then said, yes, that would be wonderful. So anyway, that's kind of the long and short of it, how I got onto the team, kind of discovering like there's something in me that I care about this stuff. And it's grown over time, of course, but that's kind of where it started.
Yeah, that is a awesome story. I just want to say, like, I love the theme of ordinary in your story. Like your background with construction resonates with who we are as Ordinary Movement. Like Jeremy, the founder, he has a background with real estate and took what he had learned and just his own, like he was leading small groups, doing ministry, but in the world of business was the majority of his time, and felt God challenging him to do even more with all that he had learned from that field. And I think, to your point, to your story, it's just that we desire so badly to see ordinary men and women, from all different walks of life, engaging in ministry and discipleship. I love that part of that aspect of your story.
Yeah, just observing like the discipleship element. What discipleship pieces did I experience when I first started following Jesus? Like I was saved in 9th grade because a friend of my brother invited him and myself to a youth event called Acquire the Fire. This is back in 2002. Are you familiar? Have you heard of that, Acquire the Fire?
Yeah, I did Acquire Fire as well, and also grew up in church life, church culture. So I get it.
Yeah. So, and I didn't grow up in church. So it was just like, hey, here's a thing to do over the weekend kind of thing. And so I went along, and it was in Baltimore. And I don't know, encountered Jesus in a way that I never did before. And I found myself, it was during worship, and I was just crying, just bawling. And I had no idea what was happening. And I'm just so grateful for one of the youth leaders right there to have the wherewithal to like look at me and say like, do you want to give your life to Jesus? And I remember thinking like, is that what this is? Is that what's happening? I have no context for this. I have no like understanding of the presence of God is moving, brother. And it's the move of the Spirit, like all these, different things you come to learn about or hear others describe. It was just completely out of left field. And of course, when I'm encountering this, I'm crying because I felt loved in a way that I never did before. I didn't know I was lacking it, but when I experienced it, I realized I never had it. And it was just this, I just fell apart in the most beautiful way. So I'm crying, and he's like, do you want to give your life to Jesus? And it was a very clear, if that's what is going on, then absolutely yes. And I never want to not be in this place. And I was in 9th grade. And then fast forward a number of years, I started going to that church, of course. And then I get to college, went to a local community college here in Lancaster, and fell away from the Lord, not because I wanted to choose something else, but because I made the wrong friends. Like day one, the desire for community was there. Like, oh, I don't know anybody, let's make friends. And they happened to be a really bad influence immediately. Fell into abuses of alcohol and prescription drugs and bad relationships. And before I knew it, there was this distance between myself and Jesus, what I had historically experienced as intimacy and just connection. And I knew what was right and wrong, but I felt so imprisoned. I had no idea how to do what was right. And that's a prison a lot of people find themselves in, knowing what's right and wrong, but no power to truly walk in, the power of the Spirit, self-control to do what is right. Galatians 5 says, abide in the Spirit. Walk in the Spirit, you will not gratify the desire of the flesh. And so what does it mean to walk with your God? And I had no discipleship around that at all. So I was really subject to the the environment I found myself in. Anyway, as I reflect on my own discipleship journey, and I realized the different monumental moments or elements that contributed to me getting out of that rut and back into a vibrant connection with Jesus, that very much informs a lot of the discipleship that happens here at our church, and just the important elements there that are common to all of us, which is the desire for relationships, how easily we can get caught up in bad influences, the mental battle of thinking and taking on shame and condemnation for mistakes and failures, the need to meditate on the truth of the gospel, and a God who meets you where you are and leads you forward out of bondage and into freedom, and the need to be tapping into your purpose and why you're even here to begin with. Why are you taking up space and breathing? Like, God purposed you for something. What is it? And so anyway, there's a lot of elements that played into my journey that I think are common to all of us. And really a lot of work going into defining what that is, because it takes a lot of work to sit down and consider what are the actual elements that contribute to that. And can you, if possible, disciple around it?
Yeah, I mean, I this whole topic resonates well with me because I was a small groups pastor. I recognized I needed more than just a free market, buffet of choices of groups and Bible studies. Like, I was missing this intentional discipleship pathway. I actually got connected with Owen because of that, because I found that, like, oh wow, they'd already taken years of effort and work, much like I know from your story that you've done. And in creating an intentional pathway of the practices, and some of the, like, there's so much we can give someone. And so trying to nail down, like, what are the right topics to have discussions with people about that otherwise maybe it would be harder if they didn't do in a group setting, because they can pick up and read the Bible anytime they want to and get this stuff. But there's certain things that are like practices that are so counter-cultural, even church culture, that if we can have these discussions and help people engage deeply in thought-provoking discussion with each other around these, and even create like a both high challenge, high grace, like vision, accountability around these practices of following Jesus and knowing Jesus, the results are so much greater in seeing people excited to be a disciple that then makes disciples. So leaning back to you, Matt, like, what are some of those core practices or teachings that you've found have really benefited your church community by integrating them into a discipleship pathway?
Yeah. To set that up, you mind if I go into a little bit of a story? I want to rewind back into I think it was 2019. I was listening to a podcast, and it wasn't a spiritual podcast. It was just some lighthearted thing that was fun to listen to. But the host of the podcast actually started sharing they took time to share their deconstruction story, which is, for those who don't know, it's a story of a person who they would have had faith in Christ at one point, professed faith, and somewhere along the road decided or came to a conclusion they no longer believed what they once believed. And so is the process, their description of that process, that journey. So he's sharing it. And believe me, Alex, it wasn't the first time I've heard of somebody walking away from the faith. And it wasn't like I was shocked at the idea that there was an individual who didn't believe in Jesus. But I was really messed up by that story for, I think, well, I know now because God was wanting to open my eyes to see something, but it really I couldn't get that out of my mind for weeks. I remember just pondering, like, what causes a person to give up in their faith? I don't believe you go from a vibrant walk with Jesus to atheism overnight. I believe it's a journey. And if it is a journey, then there are elements that make up that journey. And if that's the case, can you define what they are, and can you disciple around it? And so I remember going to Kevin, our lead pastor, and asking him, like, do you have a book on, like, how to lose your faith in 10 easy steps? Like, I was like really curious around it. Now I could guess at it. I could, of course, hearing his story, he provided specific detail, but I was curious around the categorical categories. At the same time, leading the young adults, for 6 years in total, it was very common for me to be sitting down one-on-one with people who would just get back from like a ministry school experience, be it YWAM or, some other a Christian college, or, they would experience God in these pockets of time, these 3-month, 6-month, 1 year, 3-year type of schoolings. And I'd be sitting down with people and we'd be talking about, now that they've returned home, how disoriented they were, where they reflected on their experience of growing in Christ, which was very legitimate. And now that they're back here in their hometown, they've returned, that's gone, and they're completely disoriented. Where the community they had, the mentor relationships that they felt inspired by, and they're in a community of people going in the same direction, and they were forced, the structure of the school forced them to read the word and to worship, and hey, we're going to go share the gospel, and it doesn't matter how you feel, that's part of the curriculum, you're doing it. And because of that structure, it's like a greenhouse. Everybody planted in that structure, the majority of people, I should say, the success rate within that window of time from when a person first enters to when they leave, their growth in Jesus is just up and to the right. And so I was curious around what are those elements, because can you define what they are and can you disciple around it? Because I would get frustrated, not with the individual, but when they're sharing with me about, oh man, I experienced Jesus here, and I would be like, I'd have better language for it now than I did then, but essentially to say, would you help me build that here? Like, the pain in my heart was like, people shouldn't have to leave their home church to take off in their relationship with Jesus. People shouldn't have to leave their congregation in order to grow and be connected to God and others. Like, that shouldn't have to happen. I understand that it does. I get that. I'm so grateful for the ministries that exist so that it does take place. However, I'm also observing a trend where once people return, they're not necessarily finding grounding or a foothold at their home congregations either. And then there's this cyclical thing. Sometimes a lot of people go back to different schoolings or experiences, and they flounder. And it just bothered me. And so everything I'm about to share is like what we are arrived at and how we go about discipling here at our local church really is fueled by, there's a journey regardless. And you're either journeying away from the Lord, you're journeying towards the Lord. And I think there are very clear elements that, should you implement them, you will see a success personally and corporately. And so there's a number of books that I read at the same time. I remember a podcast I listened to a lot. It was an apologetics podcast. William Lane Craig was the name of the speaker. He's a brilliant guy. I don't know if you know him, but I would highly encourage William Lane Craig. Just listening to him, loved him. But he mentioned, there were 2 books written by atheists. One is called God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, and The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. And he quoted those or referenced those as books that a lot of college students gave credit to for their deconstruction or the reason they walked away from Christ. And so I'm like, well, I better start reading those books if I want to understand like what's causing people to question their faith, what's really disturbing a person's journey. So I picked those up. I read a number of other books as well to kind of help describe and define the journey people go on as it relates to their faith. There's an author, David Kinnaman, who's with the Barna Research, and he wrote a book called Faith for Exiles. And it lists 5 stages of faith, or no, sorry, that's a different book I'll get to in a moment. He lists 5 different categories that they define as necessary to build resilient disciples. And so I started reading that book and what's involved there. There's another one, what I have it right here, called The Critical Journey. And there are 6 stages of faith that he describes, from a person's first getting on fire for Christ to the long arc journey of a person who's faithfully following God and the seasons that are common. And so, I mean, if you're a pastor listening to this, I would encourage you to read all of these books, just to get a grasp on what are the arguments against God and what's causing people to really question their faith, and what are the stages that the life of a believer goes through most commonly, and understanding the person in front of you that you're trying to disciple, when they say they're not too excited about Jesus, it's not enough just to say, well, read your Bible more, or pray more, or make sure you go to church on Sunday. Like, the depth and nuance of what a person's going through, I think takes real purposeful, I'm trying to think of the words. Psalm 147, it says that God's understanding is infinite. God understands the specific reality and reason the person in front of you is or is not on fire for Jesus and in love with him and connecting well. And I don't know if we disciple well when we simply just give pat answers, or like, oh, just love God, or read the Bible, or pray, or, stop doing drugs. Like, well, sure, of course. When I was in the thick of my addictions, I hated myself. I wish I could have snapped my fingers and just been back to before Jesus at Acquire the Fire. You know what I mean? Like, there's so many things I wish I could have done, but it wasn't. It was a prison. It wasn't so simple as that. And so my heart to disciple people, and I feel like the heart of God, is like meeting people where they are. And Psalm 73, it says, nevertheless, he takes me by the right hand. This is verse 23 and 24. The Lord takes me by the right hand, and with his counsel, he will guide me and lead me into life. And I love that, because like, God's a hand holder. He comes alongside, takes you by the hand, and with counsel, he guides and he leads. So anyway, like, this is all the processing going on in my mind over that season. And there's a number of references. There's another reference I want to give, which is actually a research study done for the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, which is out in Redding, California. And they've had over 8,000 alumni in their ministry school since they started, which is a significant number of people. And so they hired a research firm to come and see how they're doing now, years after they went home. And it's like 80 plus pages of research. Again, the firm is IDO Research, so EIDO Research. And it's called the story of BSSM alumni. So I'd encourage you to look it up. And I have the books here I can reference, and I pulled them out in anticipation. One is Faith for Exiles, David Kinnaman, The Critical Journey, and then the story of BSSM alumni is the research here. So both the Faith for Exiles and the BSSM alumni is just statistics. It's data research, which is fascinating. Anyway, getting to the BSSM alumni story, two pieces of data that really impacted me. One was they found no difference between those who attended for 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. It was all, the results were the same and highlighted no difference between them, which I thought was fascinating, because as a discipleship pastor, I'm in charge of like our groups, and I'm in charge of classes. Like,
Yeah.
How long does a person need to be in a group in order to have the effect it needs to have? Is 1 week enough? Like, was a year? Like, what do we need to aim for? So that was a question. And the second thing is, in their research, they found the number one contributing factor to long-term health after they returned back was consistent church attendance. It was consistent connection with the local congregation. And they said, this is a quote directly from it, if the number one thing to do personally is seek God, the number one thing to do socially is to be in connection with a local church, which I loved that data. One, I'm a local church pastor, so of course, but it wasn't confirmation bias. I promise you, I wasn't expecting that at all. And this is a very high charismatic school. Okay. I was expecting those who know how to hear God's voice. Like those who are very passionate about evangelizing the lost. Those are the ones who do that. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you could assume some things, but they came back and they said the number one factor that was most present in successful believers after they returned was, when they did return, They were in a strong local congregation. They were connecting well, which with David Kinnaman's, Faith for Exiles book, completely supported that finding,
Yeah.
where they talk about meaningful relationships being so critical for the journey. And for better or for worse, you will do well or not well, depending on the makeup of the relationships you're surrounding yourself with.
Yeah.
And so this is all the data that's coming back to me. My mind's blown in so many beautiful ways, because I'm like, you really can define what creates a successful journey with Christ. You really can know these things. And more importantly, you can disciple in your local congregation around them. I think God does call people off to schools and to ministry things and all the things. Like, they're beautiful. And I love the way people grow within them. But if it's to supplement what doesn't exist in a local church, I'm not a fan. And my heart is like, how do we build discipleship experiences in a local congregation that you just need to go to your local church in order to thrive in your walk with Jesus. You just need to be connecting faithfully there. God might call you elsewhere and to do other things. God bless it, right? But this, because my heart, like, my wife's a stay-at-home mom. She's homeschooling our kids. We have 3 kids. She doesn't have the luxury to go off and do YWAM in some other country, as amazing as that would be.
Yeah, I did.
You know what I mean?
In an ideal world, it's like YWAM wouldn't exist if churches did really well at what YWAM does.
Right. Exactly my point. I have nothing against these ministry schools, because when you insert a person into them, they take off.
Yeah.
My concern is, once it's over, there's always an end date on any school or any class or any group. There is a start and a stop. But the only thing, going back to the BSSM findings around no difference between 1 year or 3 year, at the end of the day, there's that transition phase that's very disorienting to a lot of people, where you have to find your rooting again. And I think the reason people grow at these schools is because they're actually experiencing what ought to be in a local church, the kind of community and climate that ought to exist, and the kind of structure that encourages people to go out and share your faith and to spend time in your word every day, regardless of how you feel about it. You know, that kind of structure that's forced within a schooling experience forces it promotes growth. It's amazing what can happen when you just commit to these structures. And so I love the schools and the YWAMs, all the things. I love it. But it is a supplement to what doesn't exist in a lot of local congregations. And so anyway, that's really the why behind, like, what's driving discipleship, at least here at Ephrata Community Church. It's really this belief that people can vibrantly grow in their faith with Jesus. If we can create a discipleship experience effective enough, then people just need to commit to their local church, and they don't have to. Forgive me, I'm thinking about people being in revival mode, like taking off in Christ while they're doing the dishes every day, while they're making food, while they're going to their 9-to-5 job, and just like taking off like crazy. Because I believe we could all grow like crazy if we'd go into YWAM. Like your whole life is built around seeking Jesus with other people. Like, yeah, you're going to take off. Yeah. What does it look like to build that structure into your normal life, where normal life is growing like crazy in Jesus? Because it is possible, and it's feasible. Yeah. It's not a high bar. And I don't want to lower the bar. Sorry, I'm just going on and on. I don't want to lower the bar of what it looks like to be in love with Jesus. I want to equip people thinking like pole vaulting. I want to give you a bar. I want the pole so you can get up over the bar of what it means to follow Jesus. I believe the Holy Spirit and a wise structure is the bar or the pole that can help people achieve what we all actually desire. I think people, regardless of whether they're on fire for Jesus or not, we all have this thing in us that when I see Jesus for who he is, I want to be like him. I want to follow him. I want to consume his word and be in worship. But there's this disconnect a lot of people have. My heart as a discipleship pastor and as a pastor and just as a follower of Jesus is I want to display Jesus. I want people to taste and see of who God is, and to whatever extent I can contribute to that experience. Like, I want to be giving my all to that. I want to give a lot of energy to that. So I think the
Yeah.
question you originally asked me were, what are some of the practical structures, the categories? In all the research, I broke them into three, and we use this to really drive everything we do here at ECC in our discipleship, which is relationships. Second is habits, and third is your purpose. If all the research I did to try to find out why do people fall away from Jesus, or why are people taking off in Jesus, I could always find them within one of those three categories. Relationships. You will do well or not well, depending on the influence of those around you. I think about Genesis 2. It's not good for man to be alone. Like, that's written into the code, our need to be in connection with other people. And mind you,
Yeah.
Adam was in perfect connection with God. Like, there was no sin. And God looked in on that and said, yeah, it's still not good. You are not hardwired to be alone. And there's another book by Henry Cloud, Dr. Henry Cloud. He wrote a book called The Power of the Other, which is, the whole book is about the influence that other people have on you. And he has this quote where he says, your ability to get to the next level, or to grow, in my words, to grow in the way you want to grow. Your ability to do that is 100% dependent on relationships. Like 100%. And he's a smart guy. He's smarter than I am. And I hear that and I'm like, 100%, like, really? Maybe 80%, sure, 75, but 100% dependent on other people. It was something to at least just pause and consider how necessary relationships are for us to do well in our walk with Jesus. I think the most important relationship, of course, is our connection to God through the Holy Spirit. Is I'm interacting with the Lord, of course, but other people, who am I surrounding myself with, and what influence are they having on me? Secondarily would be habits. A number of books that I read on habits. One that I would highly recommend is Atomic Habits by James Clear, where it doesn't only talk about how habits or why habits are so important, but he gives really clear strategy on how to implement habits into your life. But essentially he says, like, your life is not made up of what you want it to be. Your life is the product of your daily habits, and your daily habits will determine where you go. And so anyway, yeah, your daily habits are huge. And he also says, which I love, he says, meaningful change does not require radical change. I love that, because it's very common, at least in the Christian circles, for people to go cold turkey on stuff, or to say, you know what, I'm never watching a movie again. I'm going to spend 4 hours a day in the Bible, and that's going to contribute to vibrant connection with Christ. And my heart in discipleship is like, you know what does one step look like today? Maybe instead of watching 4 hours of Netflix every night, why don't we just boil that down to, before you turn Netflix on, just read one verse. Just start with one verse. And again, this may sound silly to a lot of people. I went extreme on thinking through what is the most attainable first step a person can take. Because if we can help them attain that first step, then we can build upon it, and we can build upon it, instead of trying to pressure people to change everything overnight. And then it's so unattainable, they don't get there, and then they fail. They revert back to where they were, and then they feel more condemnation and shame. And it can reinforce a faith that, you know what, I tried it and didn't work. And that's not true. So my heart is just like, what are some attainable steps that we can create within discipleship curriculums and experiences that the majority of people who hear about an opportunity can go, I can do that, or I can take that step. And then you have a lot more people saying yes to a step towards Christ, as opposed to, no, that's only for the spiritual elite, or those who have the luxury of being able to go off to another country on a mission trip, or whatever the case. So relationships, habits, what are habits that we can begin to build in people that, again, my goal, and how do I say this? I direct the discipleship at ECC, a lot of which happens within what we call our semesters. So we have a fall semester and we have a spring semester. And so it's the whole structure in which I build discipleship is within a frame of 3 months on either side of the fall and spring. But my perspective is, you have 80 years of life left, or you have 50 years of life left, or 100 years of life left. I want you on fire for Jesus 10 years from now, and not just for the next 3 months. I am confident that in any one of our groups, you could actually grow in Christ over 3 months. But that group will come to an end, and you have something that you need to be able to take a next step and keep growing. So anyway,
Yeah.
relationships, habits, the last one's purpose. And I'll be quick. Simply to say, we are all created by God for a purpose, and it's to represent Jesus to other people. And when you tap into that, and when you experience it, whether it's being an encouragement to another person or serving somebody, or sharing the gospel, or preaching a message, whatever the case is, when you tap into your purpose, in 1 Corinthians 12:7 actually says, the manifestation of the Spirit has been given to every single person, or to each one, for the common good. And so every single follower of Jesus actually has a gift, or, as it says in that verse, the way the Spirit wants to manifest on and through you for the common good, for someone else's benefit. And when you do that, when you see another person experience Jesus through you, you actually tap into this, oh my word, this is what I was born for kind of experience. Like, I realize why I'm alive. And you draw fulfillment from that. John 4 would be another quick reference, where Jesus said of his disciples, to his disciples, after he ministered to the woman at the well, he said, I have food to eat that you don't know about. My food is to do the will of God who sent me. And there's a sustenance, there's a food that we are intended to consume as followers of Jesus, that we're only consuming when we're performing the will for why God put us here, when we're performing a service that's benefiting and blessing another person. I'm consuming of it, something that's nourishing to my soul and my spirit. I realize, oh my word, I'm only ever eating this as I'm giving away to another person, and how crucial that is in the life of a believer. That's not all about you, but it's actually about Jesus showing up through you so another person can encounter him. Anyway, so real quick, I'll pause and put it over to you, but relationships, habits, and service, everything we're doing here at ECC is really just through that lens. In what way are we helping build relationships and strengthening habits and encouraging people to discover what their purpose is, and then providing opportunity for them to step into it? And I believe if you do these three things well in a church culture, you can see people who engage in that culture really taking off. It's within the context of normal life while they're taking their kids to soccer, and they got to go back to work, and they got to make it all work, balance all the things, and wash the dishes, and they have trouble sleeping because there's a newborn. Like, life happens. I want people to be equipped to follow Jesus and be on fire in the midst of normal life. And so how do we build that? Anyway, I'll pause there.
No, I love it. I have a lot of thoughts. My first is a question though, like, and I think I have a suspicion, but like, how many years have you studied discipleship to get to this like you have a really well thought out conclusion that you feel like is a framework?
There was about 2 years of like curiosity study and just taking a bunch of notes. And then there was about 3 years of implementing that curiosity to see it start to work. So I don't know, about 5 years or so since this all started, 4 to 5 years, since I started reading all these books and kind of collating all this data and wrestling with it to try to find some categories. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I can tell. And then one of the things I love, I mean, you and I, we just met, but we were talking earlier about ordinary movement. Like we have, I think, almost all the same things, maybe said differently, in common. We focus on intimacy with Jesus, which is going to be really focused on like abiding and the secret place and a prayer life and seeking Jesus and hearing his voice, going after him, time in his presence. Right. The second is intentional relationships, and not just meeting to do session work and discuss Bible, but also like meeting to do life and building relationships that are meaningful and talking about Jesus and knowing how to pray for one another, and really intentional, not just like surface level fellowship on Sunday. And then third is that multiplication piece, which is what you're talking about, that purpose of like, what does it look like for someone then to take what they've learned and now apply it, but not just like internally, but externally, and living on mission.
Right.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I love it because it's so cool to hear someone else saying the exact same things, differently in different ways and in your own unique way, like
Mm-hmm.
approach, but in full agreement. And I'm inspired, honestly. It's really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So the way they show up, kind of getting really into the nuts and bolts of like, how do we go about showing, creating discipleship structure for these things to show up well.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned, we do everything we do in semesters. I actually took those three and created a specific discipleship curriculum out of it. We call it Thrive Discipleship. It's only 12 weeks long, but it was the one group that I was able to kind of force all three of those elements into it really purposefully. But that exists in the midst of a number of other offerings.
Yeah.
Again, the main goal in all of these offerings is, and this really is driven from the data I shared about the necessity of church attendance, healthy church attendance. No matter the group a person engages in, when it's over, there ought to be a greater connection to the church at large as a result. And where they feel more inspired to be, I'm going to be there on Sunday, I'm not going to miss it, or I'm going to make sure I sit with that person, or I'm going to invite them out to lunch after service, whatever the case, that the connection to this is where God has called me. It's not just where I go to church. This is where I'm called to be part of a community of people, because we're all people are driven to groups. They're driven to congregate around a shared common idea, whether it's at your workplace. So a lot of people relate to those they work with, and that's their circle of friends. It could be relatives. I'm friends with my family. Ideally, there's also your church culture as well. And so everything we're doing is like, how are we driving relationships? We have what a lot of churches call small groups or cell groups. We call ours connect groups.
Which I was going to ask you about. So this is good because I think I wanted to get there. So I'm happy. I'm happy you're going there. Like, please elaborate because I'm
Okay.
certain that none of this you have to do more than just Sunday morning service to grow into this. So
Yeah.
this is the vehicle, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, our Kevin would often say from the front, like the Sunday service, or we have a Saturday night service, our weekend service is not discipleship. It's a pretty strong position because you can argue, well, we are discipling to an extent. But he says, if this is your sole source of discipling in Christ, you are absolutely starving for healthy disciples. You need more in your life. It has to be more than just Sunday service. So we have everything we do at ECC is what we call groups. And then we have different two categories within them. We have our connect groups, which would be congregationally driven. So Joe and Sally say, hey, I'd love to have a small group meet at my house, and we'll just discuss the weekend message. And great. So that's a connect group. We do what we call free market or open source, where the purpose for which people congregate can be more than just a Bible study. And so we have a motorcycle riding group where people are gathering because they share that affinity. And so they get together, they ride motorcycles, and then they have some spiritual element like prayer, or, hey, here's a verse we've been meditating on. Is there anything we can pray for? That kind of thing. I have an email in my inbox right now from a person who said, I'd be interested in starting a crochet connect group. And I'm like, dude, sweet. I don't know if I'm going to join that group, but I'm sure there's other people who would love to. And at the end of the day, relationship often is built around something, as opposed to a get together and say, we're going to be friends now, let's build relationship. It's usually built around a shared affinity towards something. Yeah. And so that's our connect groups. And again, that's congregationally driven. So I'm not necessarily forcing any particular theme to happen, but we did break them up into three categories. So we have what we call our people groups. This is, again, it's getting into a kind of a tier hierarchical chart here. So we have our connect groups, and under that we have three categories that help us categorize all the different groups. One's people groups. So, hey, let's get together every Saturday for breakfast, and that's it. Let's just get together. Message discussion groups, a lot of those are what we call our people groups. The second one we call passion groups. That's the motorcycle riding, the crochet, the sport boat enthusiasm, kind of thing. It could be anything. And so that's our passion groups. And then we have our purpose groups, and purpose groups would be driven around a shared cause or a mission where somebody says, I really care about evangelizing, a local town. We say, great, that's a purpose group. Let's set that up so people who also want to be part of ministering in the streets in this town can go be a part of that group. And it's built around a mission. We have another one that's ministering to adoptive and foster care families within the community. And so that they have a heart to do that. And other people, so they built this purpose group to really serve and support those families, which is amazing. I love that. And we have another one that ministers, to a local town about an hour and a half away, where every Saturday they go to this particular town at this youth event, and then they just minister to the youth there. We also run a lot of our pastoral care through our Purpose Connect groups. And so we have a Purpose Connect group that does hospital visitations. We have over 2,000 people who come to this church. And so, we have 10 pastors on staff, and we can't visit the hospital immediately for every need that comes up, or we can't go be and respond quickly. We can respond to every need, and we do, but it might take a day or two or three. But when you have a connect group of people that can be just actionable immediately, all of a sudden they're there the same night. Like, it's amazing when people who carry the pastoral heart of God or the service heart of Jesus to be alongside. Man, they don't have to have a formal position on staff in order to act out of that purpose. Again, getting back to how can we help people discover their purpose and give them a doorway into living out of it. Our connect groups are a huge place for that, specifically within the purpose group category. And so that's how we've structured our connect groups. Again, congregationally driven, people from the congregation saying, I have a heart to do this. And then I'm responsible to say, awesome, let's do that. And we train them and do all sorts of things there. The other side of it would be growth groups. These are classes and courses that are leadership driven, meaning the ECC, we say we want to purposefully discipleship people on how to study the Bible. So we're going to run that class. It's a 6-week class. People can sign up for it. Our lead pastor teaches it. Boom, and we do that. And we have another growth group, which is how to hear God's voice. And I mentioned Thrive Discipleship earlier. That's a 12-week growth group that people sign up for. And so these are leadership-driven discipleship groups. We host our schools under that. We're starting a leadership school this semester. That's under under the banner of that. We have another discipleship, a school of prayer that's run out of a local house of prayer here. And so that's where we're really driving the relationship element within our discipleship categories. Of course, within the growth groups especially, we're driving habits and we're driving purpose. Like, we don't just teach you how to study the Bible, like, oh, here's the Bible and what it is, but we're actively integrating, here are habits. After week 1, here are some habits to implement. After week 2, here are the habits we're giving you, so that when you're done, you're more connected to the church as a whole, and you're more in love with the Bible. And then you have a habit that's already been built, or at least the beginning steps have been established to start building that habit long term.
I love it. Hey, friend, we're going to jump right back into this discussion about discipleship and disciple making. But before we jump in, let me just highlight ordinarymovement.com, because that is the reason that I have been able to provide this podcast in the first place. There's this whole community and a movement of disciple making where we've basically taken this entire process of discipleship. We've distilled it into a group model, taking people through 26 sessions. We have a men's track, a women's track, and we have a track that can fit in just for men and women together. It fits into church structures with small groups. It also fits into a person's daily life, where even if they've never even been in a small group and their churches don't have small groups, they don't even know where to begin. It is for the local church and meant to be done with and through your local church, but it is also designed for ordinary men and ordinary women. and it was designed by ordinary men and ordinary women. And so anyone, be a roofer, an entrepreneur, a business person, a stay-at-home mom, a waiter, whatever level of education you have or don't have, it doesn't matter. We've taken all the guesswork out of how do you bring together people and learn how to follow Jesus together in a high challenge, high grace environment that helps people become disciples who make disciples. And it's all available to you. Check it out at ordinarymovement.com. All right, back to the show. I think there's groups of pastors. Some pastors are already doing all this, and they're like, there's probably some things where like, man, I hadn't thought of that. I want to speak maybe to the pastors though, that like, they're not doing this yet. And they're wondering like, they're like, oh my gosh,
Sure.
that guy had to study 5 years to build this. You have a very well-oiled machine. And so like, why, you've said this, but I want to reiterate kind of in your own words, why do all this? What is the end result? What are you seeing? How do you know it's worth it to do all of this? Because that's a ton of investment in time and energy to build out this entire ministry of discipleship outside of the Sunday morning service. Yeah. And I think there's still people who are on the fence of whether or not it's really needed or worth it. And so what if you didn't have this, what would you be missing that you're now seeing?
Yeah. My pastoral experience has only been within the church context that I'm in right now. When I became a pastor, I said yes to the role, but there were already 3 other pastors on the team, and myself and another pastor joined the same day. So I was never an individual pastor of one group of people. And there was, 1,500 people, 1,300 people or so in the congregation when I joined. We didn't have the discipleship structure we have now, but we did have a small group model that was very simple and basic, which is to say, hey, we need to gather people in groups, and, it's a large church, and in order to grow larger, we need to grow smaller. And so we purposefully were growing smaller already. And I stepped into that. There's a lot of people who that's not their case. That's not their experience. And they're carrying not only the weight of encouraging a body of people every week, Sunday's always coming, but then considering what's happening between, Monday and Saturday as well. That's a load that I don't have personal experience carrying. And with respect to that, anything I'm about to say has a very significant respect to that journey. I believe it would be difficult. I can totally understand it's like not easy. And so with respect to that, the reality is that people do have a drive and a desire to connect, and they are connecting. And that's, like I mentioned, the journeys. People are growing in their walk with Jesus or they're not. And a lot of it is dependent on the people they're surrounding themselves with. And if the church is not purposeful about creating healthy environments for them to connect and build relationships one to another, then there's kind of let's cross our fingers and hope that they do what they ought to do. And sometimes that's all that some leaders have the capacity to do. They're pouring everything out into encouraging a body of people every week. And they're saying, God, I need to trust you with the rest. And their prayer life is on point because they with necessity have to be trusting God with all of it. But I would encourage people to realize, or I would encourage people to see, or hope that people could see how simple it actually is to start. And this didn't come natural for me. I am very much a helper type of personality, and I'm not a strong D personality. Put me in the leadership role. I know how to delegate to everybody. I'm like, oh, things need done, I'll do them. That's really where you'll find me. And so it's a beautiful thing. Of course, the shadow side, the negative element is I did everything myself, and it is totally not scalable. It is absolutely not going to grow. And there's only so many people that would be within my individual reach to influence if I did everything myself. And lastly, purpose. I'm not the only one out there who found deep fulfillment in serving. There's a lot of other people who they're like, man, if I knew there was a need, I would serve. Well, maybe part of the needs we start to communicate is, hey, we need to be in community. We take purposeful steps here at ECC, especially the size of the church is really easy for people to walk in and walk out and you never meet them.
Yeah.
And we're very purposeful to create a culture where people are hanging around, lingering for hours after a service is over.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And
It's cool.
of course, some people will leave, of course, right afterwards. But like people hang around, and that's not necessarily a universal reality or a phenomena within the Christian church. I think it can happen where you're purposeful about building relationships and the value of the neighbor, the one beside you. Anyway, trying to get back on point with your original question, I would encourage people to, I don't think you have to study 5 years for this kind of in order to implement. I think you first consider the fact that Genesis 2:18, it says, it's not good for man to be alone. And there's a lot of people that are lonely. There's a lot of people that are alone in there. They might have friends, but they're alone in what they're carrying. And a vibrant, healthy community really begins with it's not just about hearing a message about Jesus. It's about encountering God, and oftentimes it's through other people. Let me give you another example. And you can interrupt me anytime. You push my play button, I can get excited and go.
Honestly,
go ahead.
If I was a pastor, I didn't have small groups going yet, and I recognize there's a void for better discipleship, where do I start?
Yeah. Luke 5 is the story where Peter is called by Jesus, and it's surrounded by Jesus telling Peter to go catch fish. Hey, cast your net on the other side. He says, well, I've been fishing all night, caught nothing, but because you told me to, I'll do it. And he catches all this fish. Now, what's profound about it is Jesus was standing in Peter's boat preaching to the shore, the crowd of people on the shoreline. And Peter was there. It says he's just sitting there. I think it says he's mending his net. So he's twiddling his thumbs really while Jesus is occupying his boat to preach. And it was after that Jesus said, hey, let's catch some fish. And Peter, once he catches the fish, he throws himself on his knees before Christ. And he says, get away from me. I'm a sinful man, which is a profound interaction. A couple things that are important to see. One, Peter did not throw himself on his knees when Jesus was preaching. He didn't tell Jesus to get away from me. I'm unworthy and I don't deserve your goodness when he was sharing a message. And it's very common for people to have a perspective that you hear a message and you're like, oh, my Aunt Sally needs to hear this. My child, David, they have to hear this message because if they heard this message, then they would turn their life around. And I'm like, no. Perhaps God can do anything. Sure. I bet what people truly desperately need on the inside is one, to encounter the goodness of God, because what Peter immediately did was attempt to sabotage the relationship with Christ. He knew he wasn't deserving of it. He knew he wasn't worthy of that blessing. He was a fisherman. He caught enough fish, the scripture says, that almost sunk his boat. You know how much value that is at market? That's like hitting the lottery. In fact, I researched this as well. Somebody with a bigger brain than I did the work of how much value that would have actually been at market. Enough fish to almost sink a boat is worth, and they did all the math, but I'll keep it simple. Depending on how much he wanted to pay himself and his three other buddies who helped haul it in, anywhere from 12 to 36 years of annual salary is how much value that fish was at market. And you sit back and it brings a new context to the story and you realize, oh my word, if I wasn't following God and all of a sudden he shows up and blesses my socks off, I think I would have the same reaction of saying, I don't deserve this. And that's what Peter did. What I'm getting at is a lot of people go through their church experience, Christian walk, thinking, I got to get my message in on Sunday. Either they're preaching it, like, man, if I just keep preaching the right message, then people will transform and be changed. I don't know. Peter's in that boat. And if God didn't catch the fish, I wonder if Peter's still sitting in that boat. You follow me? Yeah. And so the preaching is important, of course. If anybody was good at it, I'm sure Jesus was. And so he's sharing messages. Crowds are following him. And he even says in John 6 to the crowd, I tell you the truth, you follow me because you ate the food and were filled. Like there were practical things that God ministered to in addition to preaching. That's why people followed. And I think there's a practical, I think the heart of God is to minister to people in a very practical way through relationships, through hope, through getting them out of the binds that they're in, saying there's life, abundant life. John 10:10. You can move forward. You can discover me. You can find freedom. You can build relationships. You're not alone. You don't have to be alone. The trauma you're facing, you can encounter God's goodness in that place. The need for provision, he can do it, right? The miraculous practical needs that God fulfilled in the lives of people he walked with, in addition to just preaching the messages he preached. Both were important and good. I think a lot of church experiences are filled up with one, which is here's a message every week, and not a lot of attention given to how are we helping people meet each other and connect on practical things throughout the week, because that will drive, it's not about crowds, believe me, it will drive people encountering the love of God and following him and not wandering away. Does that help? I mean, that's where
Yeah.
there's a lot going on in my mind.
No, so like with the idea of if a pastor recognizes this void, you're saying, well, first is to recognize like just preaching alone on Sundays is not going to address the void. We've got to figure out how do we come alongside people in a more practical way. Is that where you're going with that? I'm totally fascinated by the story of the fishing, by the way. I'm like, oh man, it's such a wild, like I want to sit there and ponder that anyway. But I think to bring it back home, I'm fascinated by what you're sharing. How would you bring that into maybe more action steps?
Yeah.
How do I implement that?
Well, thinking about it like a healthy nutritional diet, sermons on Sunday being meat or something on the plate. And there's other things that make up a healthy, let's say not just diet, being healthy. Yes, there's nutrition, there's eating well, there's not eating bad things, there's getting good sleep, there's being hydrated, there's exercise, there's meditation and just the disciplines of just healthy disciplines of reading and journaling. There's so many things that construct a healthy existence. Thinking about that through the lens of discipleship, it's important to begin with the food groups that make up a healthy lifestyle spiritually, so to speak. Preaching is one of them. Sunday messages is an important element. The gathering of the church, being in like-minded believers in community. And what's to say in Acts that the church was continually devoted to the apostles' teaching. Like that's a huge part of the way Jesus constructed church to be experienced, is a devotion to the teachings. So 100%, but they also gathered in house to house as well. And you can read that in Acts 2. They gathered community for the apostles' teaching corporately and in house to house. So the need in humanity to be in connection with another person. You don't have to know everybody. It's impossible, of course. You do have to know somebody, and somebody has to know you. That you need to pause and consider, who are those that are nearest to me? Does anybody know what I'm going through, or am I carrying this alone? Do I have anybody that I could, if I am carrying it alone, reach out to and connect with about it so that I'm not alone? Like very entry-level questions to how are my relationships right now? And I think it's the role, I think it's the job, I would believe it to be the job of the pastor over a community of people, since that's a huge element of what constitutes spiritual health. And the pastor's role as a shepherd of that flock is to lead them into spiritual nourishment, spiritual health, to, whether they're there or not, realize that is a healthy part of a person's spiritual journey, is being in connection with other people. And to what extent do I carry a responsibility as a local church pastor to create a structure so that people can experience that? That would be like the foundational methodology or philosophy behind why it matters, because it matters for spiritual health. It does. And people are already, they're meeting in groups already. A practical step would be not to, what did I say? One, pray, right? I think Jesus was alone praying, and it was after, I know the one gospel account, it says, Jesus prayed all night. And then the next line, it goes, the next morning, essentially, he calls two disciples to follow him. And so there's this degree of like, God, essentially this prayer, Lord, I believe building relationships in my church context here, whatever it might look like, groups or otherwise, is important. And as a pastor, I want my people to experience the spiritual nourishment that comes from it being done well. Open my eyes to see the leaders that are here now who can help build it. Similar to the Moses Jethro experience back in Exodus, Moses attempted to serve the people, and he even said, I'm serving the needs of the people. And Jethro looked in and said, it's not good. You doing it all yourself. And he gives him a structure to do it. And so really thinking through leadership development and like, who are the people who I can tap to say, hey, come alongside. Can you carry a vision? Because it's not necessarily the pastor's job to make it happen, like boots on the ground, make it happen, as much as he can delegate and say, can you, who's here, Lord, that can carry the vision, the passion to see it happen here at ECC, and I can put them in a position, and their life is on fire in their purpose because they finally have an opportunity to do what God created them to do, and they do well and 10 times better than you ever would yourself. Like, you know what I mean? Like getting the right people in the right positions is so important. But that would be kind of a first step. Who is the person who can carry the vision for it? As a pastor, I think it's on you to recognize the necessity of it. And then you can identify that person who can really carry it out. That's one step I would take.
That's good. That's good. I don't want to take too much of your time. So last question. On the multiplying side, the purpose side, like what are some practical tips or things that you found that really help people to go from churchgoer to like missional living, disciple maker, multiplying, living on purpose, like the sending out? How do you not just have them, wash, rinse, repeat in the next group and just in the world of perpetual attending?
I think it begins with a faith to believe that you actually have something that God wants to contribute, or use you to contribute. You have a particular gifting. I mentioned earlier, 1 Corinthians 12:7. To each one is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. So every individual has that. I think it's a faith thing for people to pause and say, wow, I have that too. And then say, God, what does it look like in this season? And then you follow through. Like, I didn't start as a pastor of discipleship here at this church. And believe me when I say I didn't realize all of this passion would eventually be stirred up in me to the extent that it is now. When I first said yes to leading the young adults back when Kevin asked me to, I was just available and present, and I followed through. I said, sure, I'll do that. But before I did that, I was playing the bass guitar in our worship team for a number of years because that was the one way I knew to contribute in that season of time. There was the opportunity to join the worship team, and I did it, and I just served while I continued to follow Jesus. Similarly, you look at Jesus's life, for 30 years, he wasn't performing ministry to the extent that when he was commissioned and he was baptized by John the Baptist, he goes into the wilderness, he comes back out of the wilderness, Luke's gospel says, in the power of the Spirit, and then he starts ministering the kingdom of heaven on earth, and the kingdom of heaven is near you. But for 30 years, he just loved Jesus. He loved Jesus. He loved the Father. He was just in communion with the Father for 30 years, faithfully stewarding his responsibilities. Yeah. So similarly, how do we go about taking people who are joining groups, which is a beautiful first step of a person's journey in growing in God, to them being identified or at least saying yes to being willing to serve in that way? What way could you serve right now? And the way we say it around here, really, we don't say it this way. We say about serving, just take one step. Like, what's one step you can take? What's one way you can serve? Essentially say anybody and everybody can serve in any way at any time. Like, you can serve and you ought to. And actually, part of your spiritual health and nourishment as your pastor, you ought to be serving. And so we preach that. Like, this is good for eat your vegetables kind of thing, and you'll thank me later. Because then when people do serve or they give, whether it's greeting people at the front door, leading a small group, ushering, being on the prayer team, whatever the case, helping in kids ministry, like they're going to experience a blessing from the Lord that they wouldn't otherwise. So as your pastor, essentially we say, you have to serve, you need to serve. It's just like eating your vegetables, like you need it. And we really encourage people to do it from that vantage point, from a pastoral, it's good for you vantage point. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean,
Okay.
I guess for someone listening, like some smaller churches may not even have more roles for people to serve in.
Sure.
It depends on if they're kind of a young church doing the ARC model and you're just develop, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I I think that's kind of we have to be intentional about creating, even if we don't have an immediate need, then we might need to create opportunities for need so that people can engage and get further connected. Right.
Yeah. I wrote a small group leader small group leader guide. And part of it is I took a Connect group and I broke it into about 9 different particular leadership roles that could exist within any Connect group. And I share in there how, like, if you're not careful, it could all default to the leader of that group. But if you're purposeful, you can build out each of these roles and identify a particular individual to occupy that role. And it's not only just so that everybody's doing something or only so that the leader is not doing everything, although those things are true. It's really just to help expand a person's perspective to, hey, there are other ways that people can serve you might not be thinking about or even realize that are there. So for example, like, hey, somebody can do worship. Somebody can be responsible for all the food. Somebody could be responsible to make sure childcare is taken care of. Somebody can be responsible to host the group. It doesn't always have to land on the leader. There's a co-leader, of course, that just shared, and it doesn't have to land on the leader to even lead the discussion time. You know what I mean? And so the particular goals that we drive within our Connect group leaders that they are responsible for is that people in their group connect, that they provide protection for those in their group. So they're praying for and they're caring for the people in their group. And the connect, protect, and then, why am I drawing a blank on the third one? What can I do? I'm drawing a blank on the third one, but it's a good one, I promise. And, grow, duh. Connect, protect, grow. So they're responsible to make sure those 3 things are happening in their group, but they're not necessarily responsible to have to teach every week in their group. Anyway, Point is, similarly for pastors, you have a responsibility to minister the power of God's word to your congregation every Sunday. That doesn't mean you have to be the one that preaches the message. It doesn't mean that you have to be the one that opens the door for people or opens the building for people before they get there and turns all the lights on and makes sure the coffee's hot. Other people can do that. Or welcoming people at the door, helping people find a spot to be parked, or after the service is over, you can have, we call them community hosts here at the church. People that just really their main responsibility is to be a presence of welcoming. Just after the service is over, they're just present to say hi and say, oh, my name is, and just building community and connection. People have a tendency to get up and leave. Well, if you have people that are assigned to just say like, hey, I'm just going to go greet people and talk to people, and they do it so well that it's not a role, it doesn't feel awkward or forced. They're gifted at it. And all of a sudden you have people hanging around, there's community built. You understand what I mean? Like you can have roles for everything and anything. And then you have people in your church that actually have a gifting to do it, and they feel fulfilled in their walk with Jesus when they do perform it. Like it's wins all around. That would be, I'd take some time. I'd encourage somebody to sit down at your desk and just list off everything that maybe you're doing, everything, and categorize them. Maybe there's a role for this that I don't have to carry it, but I could share it with others. And it actually will be a blessing in many ways to a lot of people and to our congregation.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Hey, you mentioned the books that you have. So there's some resources I think that you mentioned you had on hand. So what are some great resources that you'd recommend for people wanting to learn more?
Love that. Faith for Exiles by David Kinnaman, which is just, excellent. There is The Power of the Other by Henry Cloud. I have Atomic Habits by James Clear, The Critical Journey by Janet Hagberg, and The Story of the BSSM Alumni, which you'll have to Google that, from IDO Research, EIDO Research. Those would be the main resources that really drive a lot of discipleship here right now, for sure. If you were curious around the why do people have a problem with the Christian faith, I would encourage listening to podcasts about apologetics and listening to what are the debates, what are the conversations being had, because if you're not addressing them, I mean, they're having the conversations. People are thinking through these things, whether you preach about it on a Sunday or not. And so just being, know the condition of your flock, the scripture says. Be mindful and caring to do your best to know the condition of those who make up your church. And then with a prayer, God, how do I lead your church? Because he's the chief shepherd, and he does guide us in it. But those are some resources.
So before we jump off, one of the things I love, like I've visited your church a couple of times with Jamie.
Oh, nice.
I love the all the families worshiping together with the kids.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It feels like it creates a discipling culture starting with the family unit. And I know maybe it's not for every church. I have kids now, and there's this great desire that I have to teach them how to worship, not just outsource that, and for them to pray and worship with us, not just at home, but also at church. Total random note. But I just wanted to give you guys a shout out about it, because y'all are a larger church. For anyone who doesn't know that you guys are, and I think people assume that to be a larger church, you have to have such an excellent production and no kid makes a sound kind of experience.
Sure.
And yet you guys are like, I think y'all are crushing at discipleship. And God is moving at your church, and you're growing. And it was just really a really cool experience to have kids running around, even kids using coloring books. Last time we visited, my daughter, who's 3.5, went up and wanted to go worship up front with other kids, and I just wanted to throw that out there, because it's meant a lot to me when I visited. It's been really refreshing.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. You're absolutely right. It is not it's not a workable experience for every church, and we've had to go around the mountain of, are we going to continue doing this kind of thing? And the elders make a decision. We value families worshiping together. There are pros and cons to everything. Cons being kids make noises, kids do things. I'm in a meeting every week. We have a weekend review meeting. And we talk about these things, which are just beautiful elements of humanity that take place when you decide to value families. And it's messy. Sometimes families do particularly wish, can you provide a separate ministry experience for children, which we do. To be clear, we have kids together during our worship part, the praise element of our worship service, which is the first 30 minutes of the service is songs. We worship together as families, and then we have then we dismiss kids to their ministry areas. We have classes, and we do provide age-appropriate ministry during the teaching of the word and Sunday. So that would be the structure. And we have to be very diligent about it. It does take work, because there are some colorful humanity elements to having children in, but it's work that we're happy to do because of the value of families being together.
Yeah, I love it. That's cool. Well, thank you for your time today. Thanks for joining me on the show, for sharing so much of what you guys are doing and what we can learn from and what can be adopted. I feel like I have a lot to consider. And learned about a lot of new things. So thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, Alex, thank you.
Hey, I hope this interview on discipleship with Matt was helpful. If you're looking for even more content about how to make more intentional to meaningful discipleship structure within your church to get movement within disciple making, check out this next interview and go to ordinarymovement.com. Check out what we have to offer as far as our discipleship process and platform that's aimed at helping ordinary men and women, from businessmen, waiters, stay-at-home moms, construction guys. We've created a whole entire process that basically equips and coaches people to go through and lead a group with anybody that God's led them to invite to their group and empowering them to do discipleship. And so check out ordinarymovement.com for all that we have to provide, and check out our next interview. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, do all those things, and we'll see you on the next one.